You're with Clement Manyathela.
702.
We start our conversation right now with NERSA, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa. The chairperson of NERSA is Thembani Bukula, who's joining us now in studio. If you've got some questions, you've got some concerns, some inputs, you want to join this conversation, you can call us on 011-883-0702 or send your WhatsApps on 072-702-1702. Mr. Bukula, thank you so much for making time. Good morning. All right, we've got your mic on now. I want us to start with the core mandate of NERSA so that you can help us understand what your mandate is, because my understanding is you've got to regulate the electricity, the piped gas and petroleum pipelines industries. And I'm just wondering, how do you then balance between consumer protection but also ensuring the financial viability in these sectors?
Thank you. As you've stated, NERSA regulates the electricity industry from the point of generation right up to the point of consumption. In the piped gas industry, we only regulate the transmission part of the piped gas. We don't regulate the distribution nor the reticulation of gas. In the petroleum pipelines industry, we also regulate just the pipelines, that is from the pipelines that come from the coast to the inland. And we mainly do the licensing, the pricing, which is the one that I think would be topical, the conformance to the license conditions, that is the enforcement of that conformance, as well as then your customer care in the areas where we are required to have customers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how are those sectors doing? Because I think, South Africa's gas and petroleum pipeline sectors are often overshadowed by electricity issues. What progress is being made in those specific sectors?
So in your piped gas industry, the gas that was sold in there or used in those pipelines was mainly from Mozambique. As you know, we are right at the end of that gas production in Mozambique, what we normally call the gas cliff. So we are now going to be looking at other sources of gas that can be used by the industries that were using the gas from Mozambique. Sasol, who was the main player, is looking at other options. In your petroleum pipelines, we have the pipelines that are from the coast, mainly Durban, that bring the product up to the inland, and that has been run by Transnet. And we are seeing a change in the way that the product is moved from the coast to here. It's more trucks these days than the pipeline, and I think we can talk about the reasons for that.
What are the reasons for that?
I think the main reason has always been that when you are using your trucks to transport your product, you've got more flexibility than when it's in the pipeline and it's going to wait for the scheduling and the storage facilities. And you also can get it to your destination much faster.
Yeah. So, of course, the issue of pricing, as you say, is one that's more topical. South Africans are mostly concerned about the price of electricity. And often when you point fingers at Eskom then says, but it's NERSA that's determining or part of the process of determining the pricing. Can you help our listeners understand to what extent you are involved in what the process is before even pricing is determined?
Okay. So let's start with this. NERSA is a creature of statute. Everything and anything that it does has been stipulated in the statutes, whether it's in let's focus on electricity for now. So in electricity, there's your policy, which is your electricity pricing policy, which dictates how NERSA must evaluate Eskom's application. And then you have your Electricity Regulation Act, which also says that you must enable an efficient licensee to recover the full cost of the license activity and afford them a reasonable return. Now, there's a part that's sometimes hidden if we go back to the electricity pricing policy. The electricity pricing policy dictates that when Eskom applies to us and when we evaluate Eskom's application, all of their assets, we must use what is called the modern equivalent asset value of those assets. So what that means is that most of Eskom's assets most of the power stations had been fully depreciated. And when you use the modern equivalent, you then take an asset that was evaluated at 1 rand. You have to give an equivalent of it if it was to be built today. So it becomes from 1 rand, it becomes 200 billion rand. And that's the structure and the legislation under which NERSA has to operate.
Is that regardless of the operational efficiency of those assets?
I think...
Yeah, because you can determine them like that, but then we're also dealing with assets here that are not at their, top functionality, so to speak.
The fact and the truth of the matter is that modern equivalent does not really consider that, and our methodologies never really anticipated that some of these assets would not perform at that level. But however, even with that, you then try and find a way of extracting those efficiencies of that. It is not as good as a new one. It's old and it's not performing at that level in the way that you would then say this is the equivalent of that. But what it does is it makes an asset that has been fully paid for, fully depreciated, to have a value. Now you can argue that that's not the fairest of way, but if you were to sell that asset to a private entity, it would probably also do minor repairs or if anything, or refurbishment, but still bring it back then as an asset closer to that value.
Yeah. How much consideration do you make in as far as public consultations are concerned? So as you determine the pricing, do you consider just the state of the country, the state of the economy, and the affordability levels of households as well?
I think as you had indicated when you started, our function is really to find that delicate balance between the sustainability of the entity that we're regulating and the affordability of the services that they are providing. And in our public consultations, which we do nationally, we take into consideration all of those inputs. In fact, when I started at the Regulator some years ago, it used to be the industries that would come and talk about affordability of electricity. That was when it was still 18 cents per kilowatt hour. The complexion of these public hearings has now completely changed. You have 10% of the industries and 90% of the consumers. And yes, what they really would want to see is electricity at the lowest cost.
And yet it increases, which is why I'm asking about how big of a consideration it is, because sometimes it feels like even after the public consultations, because I doubt that in the state of our economy now, you've got people who come and say to NERSA, okay, we see why you want to increase why the electricity is considered to increase like this. We're good with that. I mean, a lot of them are going to say, no, we can't afford it. And yet we still see an increase.
Maybe the starting point is not NERSA. The starting point is Eskom. Eskom is the one that applies to NERSA, and NERSA adjudicates what Eskom has applied for in accordance with the laws of this country. So when you go back to Eskom, and I know that we will not be able to finish this conversation without talking about the corruption, the over expenditure, and all of that. But when you look at their costs, the ones that they would put forward as being the costs of them running that operation, yes, there are increases in those costs. And yes, NERSA, within the confines of the law, finds those areas where they can reduce the cost of Eskom. But we are also hamstrung by the legislation that has enacted us.
But ultimately, as NERSA, you've got the power. So even if Eskom says we want an increase of 23%, because they're also considering, their debt levels or operational costs, you name it, the power still lies with you to determine whether or not that would be fair. And you can incredibly take that lower following all the processes and the consultations.
Yeah. It's not unfettered power. We've got the powers, but we have to do it within the conscience. For instance, I said to you that the Electricity Regulation Act says that you must enable an efficient licensee. So the first part is around efficiency. So when we determine that they're inefficient, then yes, we can take those costs of being inefficient, but still we have to allow them the full cost of the license activities and include a reasonable return. So the other area where we have a discretion is in the return. So in the return, if Eskom is entitled, say, to a 10% return, and when we look at their operations and we look at their debt service requirements, debt service ratio, liquidity ratios, we don't give them the 10%. We give them something less than that just to cover their. So we have the discretion, but like I said, it's not unfettered.
Yeah. What do you think, speaking of the price of electricity, what do you think will be the impact of the electricity regulation amendment bill? It was at some point, Parliament had passed it was proposed law. Did the president end up signing it?
Yes,
I think he did.
Enacted.
Yeah?
It
Yes.
started being operational on the 1st of January this year.
This year.
Yeah.
What do you think is the impact? Because I remember when I spoke to the electricity minister about it, there was a lot of conversation about the impact this will have on the price of electricity. And I remember asking, okay, what becomes the role of NERSA? Because if they're saying that we're going to get the most competitive price of electricity, I mean, does this move us to the lowest cost pricing available in the market? And what then becomes the role of NERSA? What do you see as the impact of this law?
So the impact of the law in as far as your grade to consumers is the fact that economic principles kind of indicate that if you have competitors in a market, the other players in the market are likely going to find a way of reducing their costs so that they can sell their product. And therefore, you are likely going to have the lowest cost produced product. And once you have the lowest cost produced product, you probably will then have the lowest pricing of that product. So the changes in the Electricity Regulation Act of introducing a market are aimed at producing your lowest cost of the electricity services. So it should be positive. However, it is also a market that has investors that invest their money in the areas where they would make the most returns. So it is not as if just because you've introduced a competition, it is going to be cutting costs or subsidizing that. The only reason that investors come in is to make their money.
Yeah.
So you're likely going to have that. Now, when you ask what does NERSA do, even in areas where there are markets, you still have a regulator. You still have an entity that must ensure that there's non-discrimination in the way that the common services are used. There's also no unfair competition in the way that things are used. Are done as we are competing. Like if you look at South Africa, for the next 20 years at least, we are still going to have Eskom being the dominant player supplying at least more than 60 or 70% of the electricity that will be required here.
Yeah.
And so you still need a regulator to ensure that the playing fields are leveled.
So the issue of the miscalculated Eskom revenue application, that mistake, does it threaten to increase electricity costs? And to give context to some of the listeners that may not be aware, as NERSA, you have admitted to making this staggering 54 billion rand error in your calculations of Eskom's revenue requirements. I know that you've announced the suspension of a senior staff member who was involved, but what's the ultimate outcome for the consumer? Because they listen to this and they think, how is this going to affect me?
So let's start at the mistake. So as I had said to you, that there are rules and methodologies that we must adhere to. So the error that was made by NERSA was not of allowing or giving Eskom in their regulated asset base that additional 54 billion rand. And it was really clerical more than being a deliberate or lack of competence. Eskom has got 3 applications that they submit to NERSA. It's for the generation, the transmission, or what is called now National Transmission Company of South Africa, or NTCSA, and the distribution. And they are exactly the same. The difference is that it's the assets that are in there, they are different. And NERSA correctly calculated the regulated asset base for transmission, correctly calculated the regulated asset base for distribution, correctly calculated the regulated asset base for generation in the first year. The error was in carrying the opening balance to the other years. that made that 54 billion rand error. But had NERSA done it correctly then, consumers were going to pay that amount anyway. So our error is not an error that's making consumers pay more. Our error was making consumers pay less, but correcting it, yes, does make consumers pay more. But it was the money that Eskom was entitled to anyway.
So the process of correcting it is what's going to put up an additional cost on consumers.
Yes.
Why was the error not corrected when it was identified internally? My understanding is that it was picked up, was it in January this year?
Yes.
Why wasn't it corrected then?
It is still the mystery that we as a regulator are still investigating. And I think, like I said, because it was clerical, because it was not supposed to have been there, because it was also confirmed that it has been corrected, we still do not understand how did it filter through into that. And what is different about this error is that, you see, in the other errors that NERSA had made in the determination of that, they were, I don't want to say deliberate, they were either because the employees were trying to find those areas in the application where they can reduce costs, but when you do that and you do it in a manner that's misaligned to what the legislation says, that's when Eskom would take us to court. In this particular one, it was none of that. It was identified sin, and it was supposed to be that, and it really was a clerical error that's why we are having the investigators. I would not be wanting to preempt what they are going to say, but they are going to tell us where our controls failed. But yes, there's a part of our controls that failed.
Because you've got your own auditing, you've got your quality assurance processes.
Yeah. So I don't want to start saying that it was a version, but that let's have someone independent who's doing this tell us how it didn't get corrected when it was required to be corrected.
Yeah, and I mean, consumers are really struggling already, and now they're going to be paying more for a clerical error of NERSA. It's not
consumers
fair.
were going to pay that amount if NERSA had not made that mistake.
But in fixing the mistake, they're going to pay more.
No. But so what was going to happen, Mr. Manyathela, was that when we did the determination, if we had done it correctly, the increase would have been what it is going to be now. But because we had that error, we then underestimated the increase. So correcting it just makes it to what it was going to be anyway, if we had not made the error.
So now what you have done, because of the error, it was underestimate.
Yes.
Yeah. So which means consumers would have paid
less.
Yes. And how long are they going to pay less before then? Once you fix the error, then the actual.
So the error in as far as the settlement, which is also still being challenged by AfriForum and another organization, is supposed to the correction is supposed to happen next year, 1st of April for Eskom customers and 1st of July for municipal customers. But it's still being contested, and that would be just for 2 years, because that was an error that was made in the 2 years. In the multi-year determination, that was for 3 years.
Is that going to be affected also by, because when is Eskom due to also ask for another increase? I don't know. Does it happen on a yearly basis?
It happens on a yearly basis.
So if Eskom asks for an increase, and then we're going to deal with this increase from the error that is being corrected, then that's like a double whammy for, even though initially had you done this correctly, that would have been an increase, but it becomes like a double whammy. So instead of like just the 1%, for argument's sake, that Eskom is asking for and that you agree to do, now you have to add another 1% because that comes from the error that you are correcting.
Okay, so the way the multi-year price determination works, we have an application by Eskom for 3 years. So we make the determination over the 3-year period, but it happens. So that increase that we have determined only gets implemented on the 1st of April every year for Eskom customers, 1st of July for municipal customers. So this correction of the error is going to be effective on the 1st of April 2026, and then the second one, 1st of April 2027, as it was for the 3 years. But beyond that, there would be a different application by Eskom. But let me also indicate to you that there is something called a regulatory clearing account that is an account that we use to say that you have given us this focus. Let us also see whether you have achieved the sales that you said you wanted to achieve, you have spent the monies that you said you want to spend. And if you have not achieved the sales or not spent the money, there's also that opportunity of Eskom then having to give back the money to the consumers. So it's not all lost, but yes, we still need to wait for Eskom to provide us with that information.
Does NERSA have enough independence legally and even politically to carry out its mandate without an interference from government or even these major energy players like Eskom? And I'm asking that because I remember a time when South Africans were concerned about what Eskom wanted as an increase, what they had asked you, like, or applied to you as an increase, and the president made a statement that he's somehow going to intervene or he's going to speak to Eskom. And I remember thinking, but he doesn't have the power to do that. If anybody, in fact, wants to challenge a determination that's made by NERSA, you've got to approach the courts. I don't know if I got that wrong, but my main question is, do you have the independence legally and politically?
Let me start by yes, and a big yes. We have the independence from that. And yes, you are correct in that if we do something wrong, or if someone wants to challenge our decision, the only route is going to court. It's not going through a minister. And even if we make a mistake in our own decisions, we can't just change it. We have to go to court and to request that application. Now, when you look at the decision-making process, which is where you really can ascertain your independence, it is the fact that you do not have any undue influence from other parties on the decision we are going to make. And how you safeguard that is by making sure that the rules that you are going to use, you make them public, you make them known, you become transparent about that. And that is a way of reducing any undue influence in the decisions that you're going to make. But I have to say that government departments, as much as we are implementing the policies and the legislation that has been established or by these government departments, when we implement it independently of their influence. We are not influenced, but we do not go and ask for permission from the minister or anyone to make the decisions that we make. So clearly independent, but I think your true test of independence is when you have the transparency, when you have the rules that are going to be used and you can take them, make your own calculations. Yes, there would be one or two of those areas where there's the discretion of the regulator, like in the return, that you cannot come to the same answer. But ordinarily, with the methodology and with the things that are there, you can make your own calculations and come to an answer after Eskom is applied.
All right, it's 10:32. Let's get the latest in Eyewitness News headlines. When we come back, we continue this conversation with the chairperson at NERSA, Thembani Bukula. I see some of your questions coming through on the WhatsApp line. I'll put them to Mr. Bukula. Your calls as well on 011-883-0702.
You're with Clement Manyathela.
702. Let's walk the talk.
23 minutes before 11 o'clock, we're having a conversation with Thembani Bukula, who is the chairperson of NERSA. We've spoken about the issues of NERSA's core mandate so far, because they regulate the electricity, piped gas and petroleum pipelines industries. And often we don't talk a lot about these sectors because they're often overshadowed by electricity issues. We've talked about the issue of electricity pricing, but also the issue of that 54 billion rand error in the calculations of Eskom's revenue requirements. And Mr. Bukula explained that, in fact, had the calculations been done right and the processes, what you're going to pay for as this error is being sorted out is what you would have paid for had the calculations been done right. I've got some of your questions coming through though on 011-883-0702. The WhatsApp line is 072-702-1702. Let me start with a question from Debbie. who says, "Hi Clement, please can you ask Mr. Bukula about the 4 additional compulsory charges that Eskom sneakily introduced in April, namely service and admin charge, generation capacity charge, ancillary service charge, and network demand charge. To my knowledge, this was done with no prior notification or consultation and significantly increased the cost of electricity in addition to the inflation charge." That's a question from Debbie.
Let's start with the cost that she has listed. These were bundled costs, and there was a consultation on the unbundling of those costs, and that consultation is still going to continue, because once these costs were unbundled, there were other consequences that were identified both by Eskom and NERSA that need to be corrected. But there was consultation on the cost, and there's NERSA does not have an option of making a decision without affording affected parties an opportunity to present their facts, views, and evidence. It is part of the process. So there was consultation. What we may have to improve is find ways of ensuring that people do see what is consulted on.
Okay, here's a WhatsApp voice note. That's also come on 072 702 1702.
Hi, Clement and the team. My question to your guest is, before you consider increasing the price of electricity for Eskom, do you consider the fact that Eskom is a state-owned entity which sometimes receive bailout from the state? And that bailout is the money that was generated from the same people who are paying for the same electricity. David.
Yeah, that's a fair question, no? Because we're already...
it's true. It's a fair question. And in fact, one of the court cases that Eskom won against NERSA was when NERSA took the 60 billion rand that Eskom was given by government as its equity injection and used it as revenue. And in accounting terms and in all the laws that you can't do that. So NERSA considers that Eskom is a state-owned entity. In fact, in the returns that NERSA would give Eskom, they don't give them the same returns that they give to the independent power producers. They get reduced returns. If you look at the years that we have looked at, Eskom, if it was just a private company and you're using the same metrics as the rest of the companies that generate electricity, would have been entitled to a return of around 14-15%. And the return that they got was 4% in the first year, 5 and 6 in the following years. So NERSA considers that, and unfortunately we have got to a stage where the cost of producing electricity has been higher, whether it is also due to the over expenditure in the 2 power stations that were built, or corruption or the others. That is something that is there, but we do consider that. And in areas where we feel that the costs are exorbitant or not aligned with the benchmarks that are supposed to be there, we do not give Eskom that, which is why we could go from a 36% increase application by Eskom and go down to 12%. It are those considerations. I also have to add that Eskom, before they apply to NERSA, they go to their shareholder and get permission from their shareholder to apply for these increases. And the work that we do of reducing increases from 36% to about 12% is considering all of the things that...
So Eskom, when you say they go to their shareholder, in other words, they go to government.
Yes.
And government says, cool, kudos, go ask South Africans to pay more on electricity, that 28%. But as NERSA, following your considerations, you can reduce that. Yes. Okay, Gus, you're calling us from Johannesburg. What are your thoughts or question? Good morning. Hello, Gus.
Yes, Clement.
Sure, go ahead.
I just I caught the tail end of your discussion, and I just thought I had to phone in. I started a small food manufacturing business a couple of years ago in cold chain food manufacturing. As it currently stands, I employ about 65 people. Our electricity charge is 7 times our rental on a monthly basis. It's become totally uneconomical to actually keep the business going. And my question is that you've got NERSA discussing increases here when the whole paradigm is incorrect. Electricity is through the roof. I don't understand how businesses can keep going. And instead of asking for increases, we should be looking at serious reductions. It's impossible to keep a business going. I've lost my enthusiasm for it. And quite frankly, what am I going to do with the 60 or 65 people that I employ?
Yeah. And I mean, this is a frustration from a lot of businesses, from a lot of South Africans as well. I'm sure this is what you hear a lot during public consultations.
Yes, that is true. We hear this, and we hear the pain that companies are going through, and we sympathize with that. And I think that the introduction of the market to try and reduce the cost of electricity is one of the initiatives that the state or the government is taking. But from the regulator, we also look at ways in which these costs can be reduced. I don't know how big, but I think 65 is also not a. I mean, it really doesn't matter how big but the fact of the matter is the price of electricity, yes, has increased, and maybe the introduction of the market is what is going to assist in reducing the price of electricity.
Yeah. Tshepo on Twitter is asking that, Clement, we've been celebrating Eskom's performance recently. If Eskom is doing so well, why are we not seeing the price of electricity also go down?
I'm not sure if those two, there's a linear relationship between those two. But having said that, I've indicated to you that we will have the regulatory clearing account, which will then enable us to look at areas where Eskom has not performed according to what we had given him the money for, and therefore give back to the consumers. But generally, when you are running a business, you run it such that you must have retained earnings so that you can continue your operations. I don't think Eskom Eskom is a company. It's not a non-profit organization, so it is structured to make profits. But yes, our function is to ensure that they don't make excessive profits.
At the cost of us as consumers. The High Court in Pretoria recently found that NERSA's cost studies and consultation processes were inadequate. What was NERSA's prior position about making those cost studies public? Because you spoke about transparency earlier and why that is important. And I'm trying to understand why, if indeed as NERSA you believe that the cost studies upon which municipal tariff applications are based are confidential and not for consumers, and why, if you believe in transparency.
NERSA did not. Okay, let's start with the cost of supply studies. Are studies that are done by municipalities, and it is by law that before they apply for any tariff increases, they must have done a cost of supply study. So these cost of supply studies are studies that are done by municipalities, and municipalities have their own consultation processes that they undertake when they do these cost of supply studies. And in some cases, they had indicated that their cost of supply study is confidential. In other cases, they would not indicate that. Now, the court case in the Pretoria court case was indicating that when we do the tariff increases next year, we must enable the consumers in that part of the consultations to also have a view at your cost of supply studies that are done by municipalities, not just the tariffs that municipalities send to NERSA for their application for their tariffs. So going forward, we will publish both the cost of supply studies from the municipalities as well as the tariff applications by the municipalities. Yeah. But I must stress and add that this process of the consultation around the cost of supply studies is also required to be done by the municipalities, and most of them have done this.
Do they submit these cost studies on time, the municipalities?
I think that has always been the issue in the 20 years of NERSA regulation. that sort of submission was not 100%, but I have to say to you that last year, it was the first year in the 20 years that all 177 municipalities that are regulated by NERSA submitted their cost of supply studies.
Okay. It's 12 minutes now before 11 o'clock. Ntando, I see you. I'll start with your call after the break.
7:02.
The Clement Manyathela Show.
Let's walk the talk.
9 minutes before 11 o'clock. Ntando, you're calling us from the city of Johannesburg. Good morning.
Morning, Sir Clement and Oslalu.
Sure. Go ahead.
The question is this: one, how does NERSA, as correctly said, the chairman said, that there is a study, a cost of sales study. When you have a city like City of Johannesburg, we have street lights on throughout the day. So it might not be their competency, but surely in terms of how that feeds into the overall cost that a city or like City Power would request, surely such considerations should be taken into account. That's number one. Number two, as the price determination on a year-on-year basis, as far as I remember, Eskom has received so many bailouts. And on top of that, I remember the president in Saudi Arabia receiving a huge chunk of money in terms of sorting out the debt of Eskom. And by the way, Eskom was never created to be a profit-making entity from its inception. It has been bankrupt many times, even when it was started. But my point, what I want to push is, has NERSA considered all the bailouts that have been received thus far to say, well, Eskom, by now you should be in a better position not to be asking for such high year-on-year increases? Thanks.
Ntando, in the city of Johannesburg, thank you so much for your call. Mr. Bukula?
Thank you. I want to start with the part around the street lights and that they're part of the determination. I think when we look at the cost of supply studies, we also do the trending of the costs. We don't just take the cost of supply studies of the municipalities and say that just because you said your increases. In fact, let me add that most of the cost of supply studies have indicated that municipalities wanted increases in the range of 30 to 40%. We have not allowed them that. We have allowed them the increases that we think are appropriate. So we do consider that. To come to the second one around Eskom being yes, Eskom was formed as a company of the government, but for it to continue doing what it has to do, it has to make certain profits. And yes, it is not one that's going to make, it gives dividends to the government. But the one I wanted to come back to around, does NERSA consider that Eskom gets given cash injections by government? Yes, NERSA considers that Eskom gets cash injections from government. And in the way that we consider it, we also have to accept that Eskom has built a couple of power stations that went over the budget that was initially there for them, and therefore the costs went in a direction that was not initially anticipated. And in the way that we look at Eskom's pricing with this modern equivalent asset value, yes, we do limit the cost of those power stations that have been overspent to what the modern equivalent should be. So as much as we do what we have to do, I have to keep stressing that we do it within the confines of the legislation that says that we must do this. What is true, though, is that we have got now to a stage where using the modern equivalent asset value for Eskom to recover the cost and for Eskom to go through its bill program has probably expired. We now have to revise, but we're not the ones revising the electricity pricing policy. Yes, we have given inputs and whatever influence we have on the state looking at that. And yes, the government is revising the electricity pricing policy. So I doubt that by the next determination we would be using the same electricity pricing policy, which is a consideration of the fact that you have now gone over the hill that you needed to go through. Now you need to normalize things. So the point that the gentleman is making is correct, but yes, it is under consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, Clement. NERSA must stop taking us for a ride. Before they can approve any tariff increases, they must force Eskom to go and disconnect all these illegal connections that are hidden in plain sight all over the townships and the plots. That's where the biggest hemorrhage is happening. But no, instead of telling Eskom to go do its job so that, we cut all these losses, they're very quick to punish us, you and I, the loyal customers. And you know what? We're all going to have to resort to, illegal connections and other sources of electricity because of this kind of sloppiness.
So please don't resort to that. So here's something you said that I think also has been missed is before Eskom before they even come to you for an application, whether they want a 30% increase or a 15% increase, they go to the shareholder, right?
Yes, that's
they
correct.
go to government and they say, government, we want South Africans to actually pay 30% increase in electricity. And government as the shareholder says, oh, we're good with that. Then they come to you as NERSA, they make the application. And often, once you've made your own determinations and public consultations, if they're asking for 30%, sometimes you give them 25 or 10 based following your consideration. That's why they end up taking you to court.
Yes, that's correct.
But you are now seen as the bad guy most of the time. Like this listener who says, yeah, but you are punishing us because at the end of the day, it's NERSA that gives the final determination of this is how much the price of electricity is going to be. But actually, government has given that the green light. Eskom often most are not ask for a higher tariff increase, and you normally actually take them down.
That's correct. I suppose that is one of the pleasures of working for a regulator, that from Eskom's side, you are a bad person because you didn't give them what they want. And from the consumers, you are also a bad person because you've given something. So I think it's part of the job. But I think when we do it diligently with the instruments that we have within the confines of the legislation that has enacted us.
Yeah. Just lastly, what measures and steps have you put in place to ensure that error that we spoke about earlier does not happen again?
We have relooked at our. I also have to say that maybe part of I'm not making a confession on behalf of the regulator. Part of how the error happened was also the complacency around the regulator having done 6 of these determinations and never made a clerical error. And what we have done now is we have introduced further steps that would ensure that once corrections have been made in a meeting, because these were public meetings with this correction, then there's a further vetting process before it moves to the next committee. And we also are going to improve on our document control and version control processes, because if it was still in the olden days where these things were printed, chances are it would never have happened because we would have had to print another one. But yes, we are looking at everything and anything that can be done to ensure that we don't have this error again.
All right. Thembani Bukula, NERSA Chairperson, thank you for speaking to us this morning.
Thank you, sir.